If you are just going through the motions and, putting a penis in a vagina and just having an orgasm and calling it a day, you will not get into a flow state. So instead, if you think about, okay, not necessarily what do I want to do differently, but how do I want to feel differently? Do I want to feel really romantic and connected? Do I want this to be more of a playful?
Welcome to the Self-Care Goddess podcast, where healing stories, practical self-care strategies, and science-backed tools to regulate stress, feel calm, grounded, and energized come together to help you reclaim your vitality. I'm your host, Rita Savoya, holistic nutritionist, trauma-informed breathwork coach, and founder of Breathwork Barista. This podcast is for women who are ready to restore their energy and radiance, reconnect with their bodies, reawaken their inner power, and redefine self-care as a way of being. Through science meets soul practices, restorative mind-body tools, and real stories of transformation, we'll explore how true well-being can help you live with more joy, vibrant health, and authentic connection to yourself and those you love. Take a deep breath in, let it go, and let's begin. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Self-Care Goddess podcast with today's theme, Secrets to Lasting Intimacy, Connection, and Happy Relationships. Looking forward to speaking to our guest here today. But before we move ahead, you know how it works here on the Self-Care Goddess podcast. We are going to walk the talk and allow just a few moments of introspection by following the breath flowing in and out of your body. So I invite you, if you can, lower your gaze or even close your eyes. Really tune in to how you're feeling today. Maybe perhaps allowing the breaths to channel into those areas where you might be feeling some discomfort, maybe some tension, allowing the exhales to wash away that tension, discomfort. So breathing into those areas and then allowing the exhales to soften and relax those areas. Following your breath in and out of your body, and just welcoming and noticing whatever is there. On your next inhale, I invite you to channel that inhale into the area of the heart. So allowing the inhales and the exhales to flow in and out of your heart area. Energizing this beautiful organ that's keeping you alive. And I now invite you to visualize someone that you're grateful for today. Imagine them right in front of you. Smile and radiate all the love, the gratitude, and the appreciation from your heart to their heart. I now invite you to turn this love, this gratitude and appreciation for this special person towards yourself, for being here, taking a time out for self-care and self-love. On your next inhale, I invite you to slowly flutter your eyes open if closed. Normalize your breath and come back. Thank you for participating in that quick coherence technique, giving you a few moments just to check in and let go of anything that might be causing some tension and stress. Well, today we have Dr. Emily Jamia, is a sex and relationship therapist and USA Today bestselling author of Anatomy of Desire: 5 Secrets to Create Connection and Cultivate Passion. She speaks nationally and internationally to a diverse range of audiences, including educators, health and mental health professionals, executive and corporate groups, and the general public. Her expertise has been featured in Oprah Magazine, CNN, USA Today, NBC, and more. She offers online workshops as part of her mission to make her knowledge accessible to everyone. Dr. Jamia is an award-winning columnist for Healthy Women. She hosts the popular Love and Libido podcast, writes for Psychology Today, and posts across the social media channel, all of them. So I am so excited to talk to you today, Doctor. How are you?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So, can you share us a little bit more what has inspired you to embark on this amazing journey that you're on here?
Oh my gosh. So I've been doing this work for a long time. And I think I reached a point in my career where, I could help people regain control over their erections. I could help women have orgasms for the first time. I could help them overcome things like painful sex. And I could do a lot to help couples navigate mismatched libidos. But I always scheduled an accountability session a couple months after the couple had reached their goals, just to kind of check in to see how things were going. And it was in those sessions that I noticed a pattern emerge. People would say things like, "We're a lot better than we were when we first came to see you," which I was like, "Okay, good. That's the idea here." But then they would say things like, "It's just still not quite as intense as it was in the early days or in the honeymoon phase." And so I'd kind of give them my canned response about the honeymoon phase, about how that's just a temporary yet intoxicating mix of neurochemicals designed for pair bonding, but that it's not sustainable. And, or they'd say things like, "We just want it to feel like it seems to feel in the movies." And I'd explained, that those are paid actors who go through a lot of rehearsal and multiple takes to get those scenes just right, and how that's not a realistic goal either. But I knew what they meant. And at the time, I kind of felt like the ones who, had figured out how to sustain it for the long haul were just lucky. Maybe they just loved each other more or had a stronger chemistry. And, but I started paying closer attention to the language my clients were using to describe the sex they wanted. Words like effortless, or "I want the world around me to disappear. I want to feel lost in the moment." That it occurred to me that they were using flow state language. So for people listening who don't know what a flow state is, it is a decades old term coined by an American Hungarian psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
Wow, you got that, eh?
Oh yeah, I've had to learn. When you cite someone in, probably 100 times throughout the book, you have to know how to pronounce their name. So flow state describes the state of mind we enter when we are so fully engaged in an activity that we experience kind of a loss of space and time, a sense of unity and merger, total control, intense presence. So think of a surfer who's at one with the wave. And, most people can probably think of something in their life that puts them into a state of flow, or they can connect with an experience, at a time maybe in the past where they've kind of had that sense of everything just clicked. Maybe your friend who's addicted to that runner's high, a surgeon who can operate for hours without stopping to pee. I mean, that's all flow state. So it's familiar with flow, but it wasn't a concept I had ever heard about in relation to sex, which was kind of shocking to me, because I'm like, well, yeah, like, wouldn't it be great if we could figure out how to hack a flow state during sex? Like, it's kind of described as one of our peak psychological states. It's, when we experience the greatest enjoyment. I'm like, well, yeah, I think everyone should have flow state sex. So I turned to the literature just to see what I could find, and there was nothing out there. No research, no theory. Csikszentmihalyi mentions it briefly in his book Flow, but it wasn't really something that had been explored using any kind of scientific methodology. So I initiated a research study and went on to publish my findings. And I can talk more about that if you'd like, but the most interesting part of my research, I think, after I collected the quantitative data was and I'll say what I found through that was that there was a strong correlation between flow state and sexual satisfaction, meaning that couples who were most sexually satisfied counters. And not only that, being able to get into a flow state was a predictor of great sex, which was exciting to me as a clinician because I'm like, okay, by teaching people more about flow, I can help them bridge that gap and apply those principles to their sex lives. And so what I did then was I called up my research participants who got the highest scores and had really long, in-depth conversations with them about, what specifically they did to get into that state and what it was like for them. And it was through those conversations that these 5 themes emerged, which kind of set the foundation for this 5 secrets in the book.
Amazing. I love that. That is so super fascinating how I'm very familiar with the flow state and I'm very familiar in some of the things that I do. And they're like, people are just like, why are you working on a weekend? I'm like, because I am enjoying this. I got my music, I got my coffee. Like I am in such a flow state when I'm creating content.
Yes.
And that's why I can be, creating content forever. And I feel like I'm probably never going to retire because I love this.
Yeah.
It drives me, right?
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, to apply it in a sexual relationship content, that's pretty fascinating. So in terms of, do we need to be ready like at a certain stage of our relationship to be able to like a maturity level, let's say, or at least you said past the honeymoon? How long is the honeymoon stage, by the way? I was a proponent of, I know, I was a proponent of honeymoon for life. Let's do this. Bruce Lipton talks about this a lot, right? So like, okay, that, yeah, it hasn't worked for me, Emily. No.
Doesn't work for anyone, and that's not a bad thing. So to answer your question, the honeymoon stage only lasts between 6 to 18 months on average for people, which does kind of suck because it does feel very euphoric and exciting and intense, and everything does feel effortless. And it can feel like you're in a flow state when you're with that person and having sex with them. But the people I spoke to in my research, looked back on the honeymoon stage and they're kind of like, that was nothing compared to what we're experiencing now. Now that we know each other at a much deeper and more intimate level, now that we've gone through maybe some significant hurdles or transitions and had to find each other again or anew or, whatever it may be, that creates that deeper level of intimacy that then puts you into kind of a more intense state than what you experience in the honeymoon stage. And just to kind of nerd out for a second on kind of what's happening chemically.
I love that. Let's geek out.
Yeah. So, in the honeymoon stage, like I said before, we get this very intoxicating mix of neurochemicals. We get tons of dopamine, we get norepinephrine, which kind of gives us that adrenaline rush, and dopamine's the reward chemical. And we're so flooded with it because of the novelty and the getting to know someone that it's almost like we are high on cocaine. The rose-colored glasses are on, everything is good in the world, but we get a dip in serotonin. Why is this a problem? Serotonin is what makes us feel calm and at ease. So while everything is exciting in those early days, you're more likely to stay up at night thinking about the person or wondering if they're going to call or checking your phone. It's kind of there's an anxious feeling that comes about with that dip in serotonin. So people who have low serotonin have things like OCD, which is why we get so obsessive about our partner in the early days. It's not necessarily a state that you want to stay in.
No, right.
But when we're in a flow state, we get the dopamine, we get the norepinephrine, we get an increase in serotonin. We get something called anandamide, which helps kind of tighten our focus and sense of alertness. And just like in honeymoon, we get that oxytocin from, the touch and the bonding and everything else. So essentially, you're getting a lot more neurochemically further down the road, once you have that intimacy and familiarity with someone. assuming the sex is good and the other elements are there, then you get in the honeymoon stage. So for people who are looking back and trying to recreate that, I'm like, no, 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 no. Let's look forward instead and try to create something even better.
I love that. So I'm familiar with personal sort of development and how to get into that flow state in intimacy. How does that work?
Yeah, well, let me kind of start by just so I kind of understand, like when you say get into it in personal development, how would that be?
Just find something that really, like, I feel like it's when you're doing it, time is timeless.
Sure.
Time flies. So you're kind of in that activity, whatever it is, whether for me, it's creating, or even when I'm out walking or nature hikes, like that's just, I'm just absorbed in that.
Kind of zone. Yeah. And so I think a lot of people think of flow as happening individually, like you just described a couple of individual activities, or maybe, for me, it's painting, or, a musician who's jamming out to music, but we actually have a lot of research on group flow too. So we can see this in the workspace when a group is brainstorming on a new idea or project. We see it, on the sports field when, a team is all coming and there's a sense of cohesion. They're not able to stop and talk through every play because, it's happening at a faster pace than that. We see it in a group of musicians who's maybe jamming out, playing music that isn't planned. So, for anyone listening who thinks, okay, well, yeah, I can get into it when I'm on my own, but how do I get that with a partner? As long as everyone is on the same page about what they're wanting from the experience, like a team who wants to win the game, or like a musical group who wants to perform for an audience, then that in and of itself can be, one of the triggers or prerequisites to get into a flow. And this is where I'm a bit of kind of, it's heretical to my whole field as in sex therapy. 99% of sex therapists will tell their clients never to have goal-oriented sex. And I'm kind of like, actually, from flow state science, some goal setting can actually go a long way in helping you get into that state because you're both working towards something bigger. So that's one way. The 5 secrets, just to outline them, are sensuality, curiosity, adaptability, vulnerability, and attunement. And I can explain each of those. The key, though, is you don't have to have all 5 at the same time. To get into it, or I should say rather, in a flow state, there are 8 components of flow. You don't have to have all 8 at the same time. And in the book, I kind of weave each of those 8 components throughout the 5 secrets. So they're all there. But just to kind of come back to that one thing, kind of being on the same page is, what you want out of the experience. Or probably one of the most predictable ways to get into a flow is by striking the right balance between challenge and skills. So to kind of break that down, and I write about this extensively in the curiosity chapter, is, if you imagine an XY axis, and on the Y axis, you have how challenging something is. And on the X axis, you have how skilled you are at that thing. Okay. There's a sweet spot when the challenge is just far enough above your skills that you'll get into a state of flow. Okay. When the challenge is too high, you get anxious, scared, shut down. If you're out for a nature walk, but you are in the middle of the woods in an area you've never been, like, it's going to be scary, right? You're not that much of a nature enthusiast. If
I get that when it gets dark. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. When the challenge is too far below your skill set, you'll feel bored. Maybe just kind of walking the trail in the park you've been to 100 times, right? Like maybe not as likely to get you into that flow state. The difference then only needs to be 4%. So that's not much. And this is where we can kind of turn on our curious minds and work together with our partner to see, I think where a lot of couples get stuck is in having sex that's too far below their skill set, right? They get bored, it's monotonous, it's predictable, it's easy to tune out. But when they do something different, not too different, but just enough different, it can go a long way in helping to tighten that focus and put you in the zone. And so that's where a lot of, kind of collaboration and conversation comes into play about how to strike that right balance. So, that's just another little tip that, I write about in the book, but there are.
Yes, I love that because excuse my ignorance, but isn't the goal always the same when you're having a sexual intimate?
No. I would say no. And in fact, if the goal was always the same, it would be kind of boring. So again, to kind of throw it back out to you, like when you say the goal is always the same, what do you think it is for most people?
For most people, well, I guess to have sex and that's it, like just having sex.
Yeah.
Like most often people don't think about the intimacy and the connection and why they're doing it. And yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So this is where intention
Mm,
comes into play, right? Like, when you're, let's say, I'm just because you said you like to, go for walks or be in nature or creating content. Like you can't, let's use that more as an example. You can't create content, quality content anyway, without a little bit of focus and intention about what it is that you're trying to create.
right.
And the same applies to sex. Yes, if you are just going through the motions and, putting a penis in a vagina and just having an orgasm and calling it a day, you will not get into a flow state. So instead, if you, think about, okay, not necessarily what do I want to do differently, but how do I want to feel differently? Do I want to feel really romantic and connected? Do I want this to be more of a playful encounter? Do I want to experiment with a bit of a power dynamic? You know, do I want it to be all about me? What is it that you're wanting to get out of? Do I want to try to have multiple orgasms? And I've never really tried that before. Like that's where intention, I think, comes into play big time. Yeah, when we reduce sex down to a function of body parts, we're not going to get into flow. Human sexuality is so much more expansive than that. It's not just an opportunity for physical pleasure, it's an opportunity for self-expression and relational connection. Humans have sex for, hundreds of distinct reasons. But yeah, we're not always very thoughtful about what we need from it. It was interesting. I spoke to a couple of people in my research who talked about some of the most intense sex being after, like I write about this one woman in the book after the loss of her twin sister. She was in a period of intense grief, but having sex with her husband kind of gave her not just a sense of comfort and connection, but also a sense of aliveness, which was a nice departure from that kind of sense of deadness she felt from having lost in some way a part of herself. So, there's a lot to say, I think, about the meaning, the emotion, the feeling we want to experience in and through a sexual encounter.
I know, and I agree. And that's why makeup sex is so good. There's that intention. And I love how you're talking about intention. I mean, I facilitate breathwork experiences, and that's exactly what we start with. What is your intention? Because that's going to drive the experience to the level that it's supposed to go to, but it's just a lot more meaningful with the intention versus without. So I'm with you on that. That's great. So in terms of like, how do you work with couples? I'm just curious. Do they have like a schedule? Okay, Mondays, or that's maybe a little boring too, but like, is that something that you help them through, is setting the intention? And
So I am a huge proponent of planning it. And let me give you my breakdown on that. So first of all, I prefer the word plan over schedule. I just feel like you plan a party, you schedule a root canal. It just has a much more positive connotation to
That's
me,
true.
I think, to a lot of people. So we plan, we don't schedule. I also like to think of it as a plan B. or a fallback plan in case it's maybe not happening more organically other times during the week. So at least the time is set aside if, the rest of the week you're like two ships passing in the night. You have that sacred space to be together. Just because you plan when doesn't mean you have to plan what. So there's still a lot of room for, spontaneity and curiosity within that time you set aside to have. Alternatively, you can use it as an opportunity to plan more in depth the kinds of things you want to do or try in that time together. You talk to people in the kink community, for instance, who do get into flow state at a higher rate than people who aren't. But, one of the things they do is a lot of planning around creating those scenes so that they can do it in a safe way. So, on the flip side, you can use it as an opportunity to plan. And, the other thing to tell people is like when you were dating, you were planning it. You just didn't call it that, but everyone knew what was going down at the end of the night on a Friday. And there was a lot of anticipation, and you shaved the things and you wore the underwear or whatever. And then finally, you can always cancel your plans. Let's say that time rolls around and you are just not feeling it. You can always reschedule, and that's okay too. But the fact is, we plan just about anything else that's important and meaningful in our life. You set aside time to create content. You work into your day time to go take a walk because that is meaningful to you. So for some reason, so many people subscribe to the myth that sex is only good if it's spontaneous and random. But if we're waiting around, to kind of show up at the same level of arousal or interest, we're likely to be waiting for a long time. So, and it's like you would anything else.
Yeah, talk a lot about that with self-care and as a woman to really plan that and put it in your calendar. Yeah, this is very interesting. So what's the foundation? What needs to be there for these 5 secrets to flourish or for you to really adopt them, I guess? Like, does it have to be both people in very committed, right? Like in the relationship, like what's the foundation for this to work? Or maybe another question would be, where has it not worked? Because it's obviously making sense to me, right?
Sure. So I would say the most important foundational piece is safety and security in your relationship. If you, like the analogy I say is you have to be securely strapped into the roller coaster in order to let go and enjoy the ride, and if we think about that within the context of a relationship, without emotional safety, without trust, without security, you cannot let go and explore each other or yourself. You need that foundation to kind of serve as a springboard for everything else. The idea that the more security and safety we have in a relationship, the more boring the sex is a myth. It is not grounded at all in the research. Now, you don't want to have enmeshment with your partner. You need to know where they end and you begin. There's got to be that there's got to be healthy differentiation and a sense of two individuals coming together, because that space in that sense is really important. Like Esther Perel always says, fire needs air. So you've got to be two individuals coming together. Safety and security doesn't mean that you're like this one person necessarily, and I would not advise that. But it does mean that, when you go to your partner and say, hey, I've had this idea of something I'd kind of like to try, that, they can receive that in an open and non-judgmental way. It also means that they show up for you when you're knocked down about something. You feel supported and loved and you're cared for in your relationship at a minimum. So I would say that that's a really, really important piece of the foundation. And I write about that extensively that's what the vulnerability chapter in the book is all about, is that emotional element.
Right. The psychological safety that you need to feel within your partner. Now, is that an extension? Because I wanted to ask a question about the secrets of a happy monogamous relationship. Is that the part of that foundation?
I mean, whether you're in a monogamous or a non-monogamous relationship, yeah, security and safety is really paramount. Having sex with the bad boy or the kind of crazy girl could be kind of exciting, but like it fizzles very quickly. It's
Mm,
not sustainable. And so if what you're looking for is long-term intense sex, you're not going to get that with
mhm,
instability and insecurity. It'll be very kind of like a match. It'll be very, quick flick. And I think what a lot of people want or long for is a very kind of intense, slow burn. They want that fire to kind of
mhm,
persist. And so, yeah, whether you're in a monogamous or non-monogamous relationship, security is important. Yeah, so in my study, I only looked at people who were in monogamous relationships because people who are in non-monogamous relationships, what can happen is when they're with their secondary partner, I should say a new secondary partner, that new relationship energy that was they refer to as NRE or that honeymoon stage can kind of filter in to their primary relationships, which is one of the big benefits of open relationships for people. But again, for the purposes of this research, I kind of wanted to rule that out. So there is other research that did include people in open relationships and at the end of the day still kind of found similar results to mine. There I think whether you choose to have a monogamous relationship or an open relationship, there's still ways of kind of hacking a flow state.
mm. I love it. I love it. So, in terms of from your experience, is there an average number of times a happy monogamous couple should be having sex?
I am such a quality over quantity gal. And there's been interesting research where like they took couples who were having like, let's say sex, 3 to 5 times a month. And they told them to have sex twice a week on average, which is just a little bit more than what they were doing to begin with. And then they measured their satisfaction scores and found that it actually went down. So, more is not always better, but the quality is the most important thing. Like Emily Nagoski,
Interesting.
in her work always says, pleasure is the measure. And I totally agree with that. Now you don't want to have sex too infrequently because, the more time that goes by, the harder it's going to be to get into the headspace. Again, drawing from flow state science, if you only pick your instrument up every few months, it's going to be harder to kind of get into the groove each time you do it. So it's got to happen, I think, with relative enough frequency that you can transition. Um, as a rule of thumb, I always encourage couples to connect in some way physically, not always sexually, but whether you take a shower together or you snuggle together and just kind of touch each other's skin and hold an eye gaze just in some sort of way once a week.
Once a week. Okay.
Once a week. Yeah, yeah. You
Love
kind
it.
of need at least once a week, I think, to have some time carved out where there is physical touch and
Mhm.
emotional connection happening simultaneously. Doesn't have to be a penis and a vagina, but
Right, right,
some,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. And is this what the sensuality is for? Because I remember reading, and I try to do this as well, is, throughout the day, message each other, send each other sweet messages. So then when you do come home at night, it's not like, it's like, it's been
Exactly.
building up. Is that part of the sensuality? One of those secrets? Is that part of that?
Yeah, so sensuality is all about learning to re-inhabit the body so that you can show up fully and with more presence than you would maybe ordinarily. And this is particularly challenging for women, because
Mm,
more so than men,
I could
we are
see that.
likely to have a million things running through our mental to-do list. We carry the mental load more so than men do. So we're more likely to be thinking like during sex, did my kids have a coat that fits them for the upcoming winter? Did I register them for summer camp? Did I remember to call my sister back? Like whatever it may be, like we just have those thoughts. And more often, I hear women complaining about their inability to quiet the mind enough to focus during sex. And as I started kind of reflecting on why that may be, and I decided to call up one of the first ever sex therapy supervisors I had. Her name was Dr. Ruth Sherman, not the famous Dr. Ruth,
I was going to say.
different Dr. Ruth, but equally wonderful. And I called her because at the time she was supervising me, she had retired from seeing clients. So this would have been in like 2009. And this was around the time that smartphone, like we had iPhones, but like Instagram had just come out. It's not like we lived in an app-driven world yet. And I said, Ruth, do you remember your clients complaining about this inability to quiet the mind? Because it is an issue I have just heard over and over again. And this was a conversation we had, as I was doing my research just a few years ago. And she thought about it and she got back to me a few days later and she said, Emily, I really don't. We have
Mm.
people who would maybe get distracted by body image concerns, or a guy would be worried about losing his erection. But she said, this inability to shut down the mind, she said, I don't remember people complaining about.
Mm.
And, it kind of confirmed my hypothesis, which was that we multitask more than we ever have in history, thanks to our smartphones. And now we don't just go for a walk in the neighborhood, we go for a walk while listening to a podcast. We drive while having a conversation with someone, or we can check emails while we're having lunch. Like we're just always doing more than one thing at a time.
True.
And it's not reasonable to expect to go from split attention all day long to the single focus of sex and to be present in your body. So for people who are struggling with that, I'm like, let's talk about how to like Marie Kondo your life and your sex life so that you can kind of get back in touch with the body and the multitude of pleasures that exist within it. I think mindfulness is a good first step, but what I write about in this chapter is deeper than that. I talk about embodiment and, it just takes it kind of a step beyond mindfulness.
In how so? It's just actually feeling, like bringing in the emotional aspect.
Well, no, it's really where the mind is not as much of an active participant. The mind kind of quiets down. So when we're in a flow state, this phenomenon happens called transient hypofrontality. Okay, so transient means passing. Hypofrontality is referring to the prefrontal cortex part of the brain. And it's in this part of the brain that we have our executive function, our higher order cognitive skills, things like planning, decision making, personality, all reside in that prefrontal cortex. When we're in a flow state, and they see this on MRI studies, that prefrontal cortex, that monkey brain, actually goes quiet. So we're not using more of the brain, we're actually using less of it, which is why we can experience the bliss of kind of no more self-consciousness, because that sense of self that resides in the brain isn't there. So gone are the body image concerns, gone is the never-ending to-do list, because that prefrontal cortex, all the things we're planning all day long, disappears.
Right.
That process so with mindfulness, it's almost like a mental gymnastics. Like you notice the intrusive thought, you back away from it, you let it pass. You notice the intrusive thought, you back away from it, you let it pass. Good first step, not going to get you into a flow state.
So how do we practice embodiment in every day? So then when we're in the bedroom, we can actually apply it.
Yeah. So I encourage people to single task as much as possible. It's kind of like a muscle we have to work, and it's hard. People don't realize how challenging it is, that habit, because we're just so used to it now. But, even knowing that our phone might ding is enough to keep part of our brain distracted.
That's so true.
So, like my husband and I, we try our best. We're not perfect, but we try to like put our phones on airplane mode, in the evening, just so that we're not even thinking that we might hear a ping or a ding or on do not disturb, just so that we can have that time to really ground ourselves and refocus on each other, because that makes the transition into the sexual realm a lot smoother. Or what I'll tell people is just to take a few minutes and take some really deep diaphragmatic breaths. You do
Mm.
breath work before going into the bedroom, because that can go a long way and just calming down the nervous system. Again, when we're doing 2, 3 things at once all day long, we don't realize how activated our nervous system is, and that makes arousal really challenging. That can help. And giving more time to transition is important. So, I think especially in heterosexual couples, when let's say the male partner is trying to get the female partner turned on, there's a lot of like amping up that happens, which is going to be too much to an already fried nervous system. And so instead, to do work to kind of ground and calm can actually, have the effect
Hmm.
of getting her sexually excited. When we were talking about flow, the flow doesn't happen, it's not like an on and off switch. There's actually 4 stages. The first stage is called the struggle phase. Okay. So take content creation. Like there's that period of time when, you're coming up with the content, you're reorganizing it, you're thinking back to what you've done before and what you could do different. Like you're not really in a flow state, most likely at that stage. It's the
Hmm.
preparation, it's the painter who's mixing the oils, or the musician who's tuning their instrument, or the surfer who's kind of just sitting out there in the ocean waiting for the wave.
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
Same applies to sex. Like there's going to be that period of transition where you're thinking to yourself, here we go again. I'm not in my body. Here's the intrusive thoughts. And that's where some of the mindfulness can help. When we move past the struggle phase, we get into release. And that's when some of those stress hormones that were present start to work their way out of the system and we begin to relax. And then the third stage is flow, which we've talked about. And then the fourth stage is integration. But a lot of times, the whole point of me explaining this is that we don't usually have sex for long enough to move past the struggle phase, which is why it can be so dissatisfying for people.
Hmm.
It just takes time to transition from the chaos of daily life, into the headspace and body space, really, that you need to be present in order to experience flow state sex.
So interesting, Emily. I have so
Hmm.
many questions because we talked also about like monogamous relationships, and how about like what are your tips with when you have kids? How does that work? Because this is what I hear often is once the kids arrive, it's just so hard to get intimate, to be intimate. And I know I have some funny stories of people telling their kids, we're going upstairs to do our taxes,
Oh, no.
finding
Well,
these.
let me tell you, as a mother of a 4-year-old and 7-year-old, what to do. So this is really where planning comes into play. You have
Mhm.
to, like my kids will always have quiet rest time on Saturday afternoons so that mom and dad can have quiet rest time on Saturday afternoons. And all the doors are locked and everyone is in their room, and this is where what I wanted this book to be is kind of a resource for people at various stages in life. So if you are in the season of life like I am right now, where, we are both working, we're busy, the kids are little and very demanding, and it is more challenging than it's ever been to quiet the mind, all the stuff in the sensuality chapter is going to be what you want to focus on. If maybe fast forward, you're in a season of life where sex has become kind of boring, monotonous, like you don't really know kind of what to do to make things interesting again, then the curiosity chapter is what
Mhm.
you want to focus on. If you are struggling to reconnect because of a major life adjustment, or you're at an age where maybe erections are less reliable, or you can't default to the position you're used to because you have arthritis in your hip now, the adaptability chapter is what you're going to want to look at. if you are struggling to surrender to the sexual experience because of some relationship conflict or because of an emotional disconnect, then the vulnerability chapter is what you want to really focus on. And then the attunement chapter, which comes at the end, is in a lot of ways the gestalt of the other four chapters. Is kind of where everything comes together, I think, to give sex that kind of that feeling of like the sum is bigger than the parts. But yeah, it really just depends on kind of what your relationship needs. So this is not a book you necessarily have to read cover to
Hmm.
cover, but I want it to live on people's bookshelves as a resource, just
Mm.
depending on what is going on.
Yeah, perpetual resource that you can refer to it. Sounds really interesting. I really love the way you planned that and thought that through for sure. So many amazing tips. Okay, so this is very, very personal too. But what are your tips for high performing couples to avoid that? That competition and conflict.
This is such an interesting topic and category. Um,
Mhm.
the qualities that make people really successful in business, in the kind of having that ambition and in those sorts of endeavors are not always the qualities that are going to work in your
Yeah,
romantic
I
relationships.
believe it. Yeah, I can see that.
And so it's good to have high expectations and push and be able to do that in a business endeavor, but in your romantic relationship, putting too much pressure on it or expecting it to be in every way optimal the way you would, a highly
Business.
performing business, is going to cause it to snap. And so what I would say, if I had to like narrow it down to one important tip, it would be to give that part of yourself a break and come into your romantic relationship with a softer side with significantly lower expectations of yourself and your partner. Not that you're going to settle for an unhealthy or unfulfilling relationship, but that you're going to leave that tendency to push and improve and grow and expand, to the side for the most part, I would say.
Mm.
I had to like
Mhm.
really, but that's like a whole other conversation.
It is.
Like down, that would be the one.
I think we should do another one just specifically on this because I do believe I work with high performing women and they embody their masculine energy a lot more than their feminine. And I feel like when in a relationship, you have to go back to that nurturing, that receiving energy of the feminine. And then the masculine has to take on that sort of giving more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
precisely. Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. So, is there a common advice that you would give a woman listening to this podcast who maybe she doesn't even know what stage or season that she's in? Just a general advice for her or a tip that she can implement.
I write what I'm about to say, I write about more in the vulnerability chapter, but no, I'm sorry. I think it's in the curiosity chapter that, women are socialized from a very young age to think that sex is for a man and, that all they should care about is emotional connection and all men care about is the physical connection. And that's not true. When I ask, so there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen for women, especially. But like when I'm working with a heterosexual couple and the male partner has higher desire, and I ask him why he wants to have more sex, I've never heard him say, because I want to have more orgasms. It's because that's when I feel connected to her. That's when I feel the most loved by her.
Mm.
He doesn't even have the words really to articulate that. So when she hears that he wants to have more sex, what she thinks is that he just wants to get off more. And why would she want to do that? On the flip side, she's been conditioned to think that she doesn't really have, that there's not as much in a sexual experience for her as there is for him. And I like to flip that narrative on its head. I mean, women can have multiple orgasms, men can't. The female body is, I would say more sensual in many ways than the male. So there is a very intense richness and excitement that women can learn to discover through sex, and also for both people coming into the experience, for it to be, like I said, a place of not just physical pleasure, but really deep relational intimacy. I just like to move away from this like emotional connection versus sex standoff, and really try to marry the two concepts as much as possible. I
Thanks.
don't see them as distinct.
Yes, I love that. Yeah. I was going to ask you, what is your legacy question? But I think this is it. That's good.
Everything we've talked about.
So, what is the best advice that you've ever been given?
Oh gosh. From a very young age, I
Mm.
was taught to advocate for myself and to speak up for others. And it's something I've always tried to do. And I don't think I'd be where I am today had I not used my voice and pushed
Yeah.
and, you know,
Mhm.
developed kind of a thick skin and had the tools to face adversity. I'll tell you, with publishing, there's a lot of slam doors, and I get used to it and keep moving forward, and yeah. So I would say to advocate for myself and others.
Very nice. Thank you. And what is the most influential book that you've read? And I know you've read many, and want to put yours on there for sure. But yeah, we collect a recommended reads at the end of the season from all our podcast guests.
Yeah. Well, I mean, say the most obvious title would probably be Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, because it inspired the book. But beyond that, what a book and an author I always come back to is Joseph Campbell. The Power of Myth. I just love. I read that book for the first time, I think in high school, and it made such an impression on me. And I've come back to it several times in my adult life, and I always learn something new. And I think more than ever, we need the concepts that are in that book. We have lost ritual, we have lost symbolism, and he draws a lot from Jungian psychology and kind of, merges a lot of psychological concepts with spiritual concepts, and kind of explains the hero's journey. And I think that's a story that lives within all of us. And so I've just always found that book really meaningful.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. What are your top 3 non-negotiable self-care habits?
So this may sound counter to the idea of self-care, but fostering meaningful relationships.
That's part of it. Yeah, for
You
sure.
know,
Authentic
it's
connection. Yeah.
so important that we connect. We live in a very individualistic, kind of self-absorbed
Mhm.
time right now, and I think we need relationships to foster the
Mhm.
self. So I would say relationships, keeping a clean and organized space, I think is actually really important for mental health, and being in nature.
Mm. Yeah.
Also important. Yeah.
You know how many, like 99% of podcast guests say some sort of like nature walks or just being in nature is so
Yeah.
important. And it
So,
was crazy. Last night I was downtown in Toronto and I was like, this is not for me. And, 10 years ago, I was like, yeah, of course I want to live downtown. I love it down here.
yeah.
But now I just love the suburbs. There's just more space, more nature, more trees. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's so crazy how your priorities change.
I live very much in the city in Houston, and I really have to find pockets of nature where I can. Otherwise, I'm like at a bare minimum, I'm like, I'm in a garden without gloves.
Yeah,
At least that.
exactly.
It's hard, but yes, so important.
Thank you, Doctor. This was so eye-opening. So many
Oh,
beautiful tips you shared. I cannot wait for our listeners and viewers to go to grab the book. Where is the best place to connect with you and also to purchase the book?
yeah, so the book is available everywhere books are sold. And actually, if you visit my website, which is emilyjamia.com, and you click the Anatomy of Desire tab, I have tons of free resources available with qualified book purchases. So there's an online
Mm.
form you can fill out, and you'll get access to my masterclass, the intimacy building discussion deck, the 30-day intimacy challenge. Like there's tons of bonuses there. So you can get a lot of bang for your buck. So there's that. And then I'm on all the social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamia. So follow me there.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much. I so appreciate
Thank
you and the
you.
work that you're doing. Take
Thank you
care. It
for
was
having me.
lovely.
Pleasure. You too.
Thank you for tuning in to the Self-Care Goddess podcast. If today's episode inspired you, share it with another woman who's ready to reclaim her vitality and lead from within. To continue your journey, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and connect with me on ritasavoya.com. Until next time, remember, self-care isn't selfish, it's your superpower. Take a deep breath in, exhale, and keep rising. Ciao for now.